The sky above Grimma, Germany seemed calm on the morning of July 29, 2025. Yet within moments, the stillness would be shattered by tragedy. A Eurocopter EC 135P2 TUS, flown under the Luftwaffe's Helicopter Wing 64 for training, suddenly plunged into the Mulde River. All three on board lost their lives, their final moments marked by the quiet countryside that bore silent witness. Some say the helicopter struck the water, level measurement cables stretched across the river, a hazard invisible to the untrained eye. I'm John, and this is PN Kia Saxony, where we uncover the stories behind history's most haunting aviation disasters. On the morning of July 29, 2025, the quiet town of Grimma in Saxony, Germany, was as serene as ever. The Mulde River flowed gently, carrying with it the reflection of the early sky, and the sounds of summer whispered through the countryside. For the people on the ground, it was just another day. But for the crew of a Eurocopter EC 135P2S, the day was one of training, duty, and precision. This was no civilian aircraft, no tourist ride skimming above the river. This helicopter belonged to the Luftwaffe's Helicopter Wing 64, tasked with carrying out specialized pilot training exercises that demanded focus, discipline, and mastery of the machine. These flights were routine in military training schedules, yet they carried inherent risks that would soon reveal themselves in the most devastating way. Low-altitude flying was one of the most challenging requirements of this training. At low levels, a helicopter cannot rely on the same margin of error that exists at higher altitudes. The pilot has less time to react, less room to recover, and far more obstacles hidden in the environment to navigate. At treetop level, or just above the river's surface, power lines, bridges, and even cable systems designed for civilian infrastructure can suddenly transform from harmless fixtures into deadly threats. For the three people on board that day, the Eurocopter became not just a vessel of learning, but an unforgiving test against nature and man-made hazards. As the helicopter maneuvered near the Mulde River, the crew followed procedures designed to simulate real-world conditions, practicing how to handle the aircraft in difficult environments. The EC 135P2 TUS was known for its agility and reliability, a common choice for military training in Germany and beyond. Yet no aircraft, no matter how advanced, can protect itself against every hidden danger. Across that very stretch of the river lay a cable system, an unassuming structure built for measuring water levels, designed with engineering precision but without aviation safety in mind. It stretched across like a thin line invisible against the landscape, blending into the background, a trap that only revealed itself when it was already too late. The helicopter descended into that critical zone where split seconds define survival. Witnesses nearby described hearing the sudden roar of rotor blades shift into a sound that wasn't right, a sound that carried urgency, followed by the sickening impact as metal collided with water. The Eurocopter struck the cable, and in that instant, the aircraft's fate was sealed. With a violent loss of control, the helicopter plunged into the river, its final moments hidden beneath a spray of water and shattered fragments. Kayakers paddling along the Mulde would later discover wreckage, a haunting reminder of how fragile the line is between routine and catastrophe. For the three souls on board, their mission ended in silence. There was no chance for escape, no opportunity to call for help. The very training meant to prepare them for high-stakes situations had instead placed them into the path of a hazard that training could not predict. This was the cruel irony of the Grimma crash, that preparation, skill, and modern aviation technology were rendered powerless against something as simple as a cable stretched across a river. The crash raised urgent questions about safety protocols in military training flights. How could such an obstacle go unnoticed in flight planning? Were maps not updated with such details? Or was it simply a case of human error, a momentary lapse that collided with an unavoidable reality? Investigators pointed to the water level measurement system as a probable factor, noting that these installations, though essential for monitoring environmental data, posed risks when not adequately marked for aviation. For pilots flying at low altitude, cables and wires are among the most dangerous threats. Unlike mountains or towers, they are often invisible until the last second, leaving no time to adjust course. In civilian aviation, countless accidents have occurred for the same reason, but in military training, where low-altitude practice is essential, the risk is amplified. The story of Grimma does not end with the wreckage pulled from the Mulde. It echoes through the halls of aviation safety and military training protocols, reminding commanders and flight planners of the constant balance between realism and safety. Pilots must be trained to operate in low-level environments because combat and rescue operations often demand it. But how do you ensure that training does not cross into unnecessary peril? The Grimma tragedy stands as a harsh case study, one that forces a re-evaluation of where to draw the line. The loss of 3 highly trained individuals is not just a number, not just a statistic to be recorded in military logs. These were lives with families, futures, and stories that ended abruptly because of an obstacle that, in hindsight, might have been avoidable. As images of the wreckage circulated in the media, the public in Germany reacted with shock and sorrow. Grimma, a town more known for its medieval history and peaceful riverbanks, suddenly found itself at the center of headlines for one of the deadliest training accidents of the year. Locals who had watched helicopters pass overhead countless times before were forced to grapple with the realization that those flights carried immense risks. The kayakers who stumbled upon the broken remains of the Eurocopter would never forget the sight. A reminder that even in leisure, one can become an unwilling witness to tragedy. Experts analyzing the crash pointed out that the Eurocopter EC 135P2S was not at fault. The aircraft had a strong safety record, widely used across Europe for both military and civilian operations, including police, medical evacuation, and training. Its design emphasized safety features such as crash-resistant fuel systems and advanced avionics. Yet even the most advanced systems cannot protect against external hazards that the aircraft itself cannot detect. The helicopter's sensors were never meant to spot thin cables across a river, a task that even the human eye struggles with at speed and low altitude. This vulnerability is well known in aviation, and it is why some have argued that all cables crossing navigable waterways should be marked with visible markers, regardless of their primary function. For the families of the victims, technical explanations mean little compared to the grief of loss. Loved ones gone in an instant, lives cut short by the intersection of duty and danger. Military service carries risks, but when those risks feel preventable, the pain is magnified. The Grimma crash became not just a national story, but a deeply personal tragedy for those left behind, who were forced to reconcile pride in service with anger at what seemed like an avoidable hazard. Investigations moved swiftly, as is standard in aviation accidents, with recovery teams pulling wreckage from the Mulde and examining every piece for mechanical faults. None were found to explain the sudden crash. The focus returned again and again to the cable system. Pilots who had flown in similar conditions recounted their own close encounters with such obstacles, confirming the danger was real, immediate, and difficult to manage. The conclusion was not one of mystery, but of oversight, a reminder that the environment itself can betray even the best prepared crew. The Grimma Eurocopter crash joins a long list of aviation incidents where wires and cables proved fatal. In fact, across Europe and beyond, such accidents have occurred with alarming frequency. Helicopters, more so than fixed-wing aircraft, often operate at altitudes where these hazards are most prevalent. Search and rescue missions, firefighting, medical evacuations all require pilots to navigate the very space where cables are strung, often without warning. Each accident, including Grimma, reinforces the need for better mapping, clearer markings, and greater awareness. But change in aviation safety is often slow, driven by tragedy rather than foresight. For aviation historians, Grimma will be remembered not just as a crash, but as a lesson in vulnerability. It is easy to imagine that modern aircraft, with digital cockpits and highly trained crews, are invincible against simple threats. But the truth is far more sobering. The margin for error remains as thin as the cables that claimed the Eurocopter. That thinness is what makes every flight a delicate negotiation with the environment, where preparation and luck must coexist. Grimma revealed what happens when that balance collapses. In documentaries about aviation disasters, the focus often rests on mechanical failure, pilot error, or weather phenomena. But Grimma's story is different. It was not an engine fire, not a storm, not a malfunction that brought the helicopter down. It was an obstacle placed by human design, unrelated to aviation, yet capable of devastating consequence. That irony cuts deeply. As long as human infrastructure intersects with flight paths, the possibility of such tragedies will remain. And so, the voices of those lost at Grimma become part of a larger narrative. A plea for vigilance, awareness, and respect for the invisible threats that surround us. As the Mulde River continues to flow, the ripples of July 29, 2025, remain etched in memory. The crash site may have been cleared, the wreckage recovered, but the lesson endures. Every pilot who trains at low altitude knows now, perhaps more than ever, the importance of caution, of scanning the environment, of respecting the unseen dangers. For the public, the story is a sobering glimpse into the risks carried by those who take to the skies not for leisure but for duty. For the families, it is a wound that time may soften but never erase. The Grimma Eurocopter crash stands as a reminder that in aviation, the smallest detail can become the greatest danger. A cable stretched across a river, unseen and unmarked, was all it took to transform a routine training mission into a fatal tragedy. 3 lives lost, a helicopter destroyed, and a community shaken, all in the span of moments. This is the haunting reality of aviation, where progress and peril walk side by side, and it is why we remember Grimma, not just as a crash, but as a lesson written in loss, urging us to see what lies hidden before it claims another flight, another crew, another day that should have ended differently. On the banks of the Mulde River, the summer day unfolded with deceptive calm. Kayakers paddled lazily. The sun glistened off the water's surface, and the sound of nature was undisturbed by anything but the occasional hum of rotor blades overhead. On that day, July 29, 2025, those blades belonged to a Eurocopter EC 135P2 class, a helicopter operated by the Luftwaffe's Helicopter Wing 64. Inside were 3 crew members, deeply focused on a low-altitude training mission that was part of their duty to prepare for real, world military scenarios. To them, this was routine, a necessary exercise in precision and control. But within moments, the fragile boundary between training and tragedy would shatter, and Grimma, a quiet town in Saxony, Germany, would become the site of one of the year's most haunting aviation disasters. The helicopter, built with advanced avionics and a reputation for safety, was no stranger to military and civilian operations alike. It had saved lives in medical evacuations, assisted law enforcement in complex missions, and trained countless pilots for the unforgiving demands of aviation. On this day, however, its mission was training, and training at low altitude carried with it a host of risks invisible to the untrained eye. The crew was well aware of those risks, but experience and skill could not shield them from every hidden danger. For all the cockpit's technology, for all the training manuals and simulations, there remained one constant truth. Nature and human-made landscapes could never be fully controlled. And in that uncontrolled space, even the smallest hazard could turn deadly. The Grimma Eurocopter was flying low along the Mulde River, where thin water level measurement cables spanned the channel. These cables were not designed to harm aircraft, yet they became the critical factor in this story. Against the shimmering background of the river and the trees beyond, the cables were nearly invisible, blending seamlessly into the environment. A helicopter at speed, flying at such low altitude, would have only seconds to detect them, seconds that never came. The machine, proud in its engineering, never stood a chance. In a moment as sudden as it was final, the Eurocopter collided with the cable, losing control instantly. Its descent into the river was swift, violent, and irreversible. Within seconds, 3 lives were extinguished, leaving only silence and debris where once there had been motion and purpose. This tragedy illustrates a sobering reality that has haunted aviation since its earliest days. No matter how advanced the aircraft, no matter how skilled the pilots, there is always an element of vulnerability. The world is not built with aviation in mind. Roads, bridges, towers, and cables cut across landscapes without consideration for those flying just above them. Technology can warn pilots of mountains and weather, but the invisible line of a cable across a river remains one of the most unpredictable threats. Grimma proved this truth in the harshest way possible. 3 people, trained professionals serving their country, were undone not by mechanical failure, not by human error, but by an obstacle so ordinary that it might otherwise have gone unnoticed forever. The lessons of Grimma strike deeply into the heart of aviation safety. It is easy to believe that the future of flight lies in ever more sophisticated systems, in computers that can sense and correct, in aircraft that can almost fly themselves. Yet all of that sophistication means little when the danger comes not from within the machine but from the environment around it. Pilots train for emergencies in the air, for engines that fail, for weather that changes without warning. What they cannot always prepare for are the obstacles deliberately placed in the world for purposes entirely unrelated to aviation. The Eurocopter's fate shows us that no matter how far technology advances, there will always remain an unpredictable factor that demands caution, vigilance, and humility. For the families of those lost, such explanations provide little comfort. They are left with questions that cannot be fully answered. Why was such a cable not marked clearly on flight maps? Could warning markers have been placed to make them visible from the air? Was this tragedy preventable if someone, somewhere, had thought of the sky when planning the river. These questions resonate not only in the grief of families, but in the broader community of aviation. For every pilot who takes to the skies, Grimma serves as a reminder that flight is as much about respecting the unseen as it is about mastering the visible. It is a reminder that duty and risk walk hand in hand, and that sometimes even the most careful preparation can end in devastation. In Germany, the incident stirred public debate. Grimma was not a city accustomed to aviation headlines, and the shock of such a crash in its midst forced many to confront the hidden dangers of military training. The Luftwaffe, proud of its traditions and professionalism, faced scrutiny not just over the accident itself, but over how low-level flights are planned and monitored. Aviation experts pointed out that while training at low altitude is essential, it must always be balanced with the recognition of environmental hazards. Perhaps, they argued, more advanced detection systems could be installed. Perhaps flight planning could become more precise, avoiding areas where such hazards exist. Perhaps, above all, this tragedy could serve as the catalyst for change. But Grimma was also more than an event for analysis. It was, at its heart, a human story. 3 people, alive and focused on their mission, were gone in an instant. The kayakers who first stumbled upon the wreckage carried with them the trauma of witnessing the aftermath. Locals who heard the sound of impact would never forget that moment of violence piercing their peaceful town. Families who had said their goodbyes believing it was just another day of training received the unimaginable news that their loved ones would never return. These human dimensions often fade into the background of technical reports, but they are the core of why such stories matter. They remind us that aviation is not just about machines and procedures, but about lives entrusted to those machines, about the people who climb aboard with faith in their training and their duty. The Eurocopter EC 135P2 FOS had been a trusted workhorse, but trust in machines can only go so far. The Grimma crash adds its name to a long history of accidental vulnerability triumphed over preparation. It shows us that progress in aviation does not mean invulnerability. Every advance in safety comes from acknowledging past mistakes, from seeing the gaps left exposed, from refusing to accept tragedy as inevitable. The cables across the Mulde River were not malicious, but their danger was real. Now, they stand as symbols of how the ordinary can intersect with the extraordinary in ways that change lives forever. When the investigation concluded, the evidence pointed firmly at the cable system. There was no mechanical fault, no sign of negligence within the aircraft itself. The conclusion was chilling in its simplicity. The environment, unmarked and unaccounted for, was the cause. In some ways, that simplicity made the loss even harder to bear. It is one thing to lose an aircraft to a storm or a complex malfunction. It is another to lose it to something that seems so avoidable. For those in the aviation community, the lesson was clear. Cables, wires, and environmental hazards must never again be underestimated. As time moves forward, the story of Grimma will fade from the headlines, but its echo will remain in every flight plan that marks a hazard, in every training exercise that considers new precautions, in every family that watches a helicopter pass overhead and wonders about the risks. For the town itself, life along the Mulde continues. The river flows on, carrying with it no visible signs of the tragedy, but beneath its surface lies a memory too deep to erase. The stillness of that day's aftermath lingers, a silent warning written in water and loss. And so, the Grimma Eurocopter crash stands not just as an isolated tragedy, but as a universal reminder of vulnerability. It tells us that in aviation, as in life, control is never absolute. It tells us that hidden dangers can undo even the most skilled hands and the most advanced machines. It tells us that the future of safety depends not only on building stronger aircraft, but on recognizing the unpredictable world through which they fly. 3 lives were lost on July 29, 2025, and with them, a lesson was written that the aviation world cannot afford to forget. This is why we remember Grimma, not simply as a crash, but as a story of fragility, of the thin line between routine and disaster, of how the unseen can change everything in an instant. And it is why every flight since then carries, in some small way, the memory of that helicopter, its crew, and the river that became their final resting place. The closing chapter of Grimma is not silence but vigilance, a call to see the invisible, to honor the lost, and to ensure that their sacrifice becomes a turning point rather than just another entry in the long list of aviation tragedies.